Now it's time for Dr. Liu. That is our second speaker of the day. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Liu to the audience. Dr. Liu is a senior scientific officer and team leader at EFSA. And particularly, she coordinates the working groups on food enzymes, the FIP unit. So I think the floor is yours, Liu, and please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Daniela, and thank you, Piesandro, for inviting me here. And I'm not going to repeat a lot of theory has been said many times by many speakers since yesterday afternoon. So I think today I'm going to take you through dietary exposure. And yesterday you have heard from David Gott that dietary exposure actually plays quite an important role in the risk assessment. Okay, I have the control, so I'm able to go ahead. I did, but it's not moving. Oh, okay, here we go. All right, and all right, so here I give you some, how to say, perhaps I calibrated some expectations, and this is the expectation of my teaching goal today. I would like you to understand a bit of in reality and all these 4 steps in risk assessment. I mean, where do the position and how dietary exposure fits in that, and where it comes in. And, you know, every day we have at least 3 meals a day, so we are having a lot of dietary exposure. So I think you feel very close to it. And however, my experience is it's a topic you can talk a lot with your friends and at dinner, and especially after a glass of wine. Very, very pleasant. But if you want to go quantitative and it starts to get a little difficult because the devil lies in the details. So I would also introduce you to a lot of tools that has already been developed by EFSA, and that is indeed to enhance your conversation at the dinner table. And so the hardcore has been taken away. And I would like to emphasize very much on the details, so the input data with some examples. And let me see, for some weird reason, why I'm not able to. Okay, so this slide again. This is just a recap. I think focus on the 3 tiny bullet points. And if you plan to do dietary exposure at your job, and you must look at the scenario models and the input data. So your goal will be there. And for the audience, which is only using dietary exposure and let's say flying over, then please listen very well the first initial part of the slides. That is the 2 bullet points. All right, so here we start. And I noticed that yesterday the 2 speakers in the afternoon, and they used big boxes and to give you the risk assessment, risk communication, risk management, and in a much more zoomed out slides, which is good because now you know the position. And today, have a look. I put in some details in it. And you can see that, it starts to get difficult by all these arrows. And how come there are solid arrow and dashed arrow? And let me just take you perhaps with the bottom and follow me a little bit. So yesterday you heard from the person from European Commission talk about the dialogue between risk managers and risk assessors. And he mentioned that it's important to ask the right question, depending on what you ask, and this is what you may obtain. And in the terminology within food risk assessment, you would encounter the word problem formulation. So the problem formulation is really the step that taking a wish from risk managers. So the wish could be, I want the food to be safe, or a better wish, which would be, I would like the food to be safe for most of the European population, or my country, or females, or young children. And you can hear these different levels of granularity and in the question, and that is effectively translated into the problem formulation. Are we have to guarantee 100% of safety, or are we going to 95th percentile in the population, or a median 50 percentile is sufficient? Or are we really targeting some vulnerable populations? Or we want it safe to be forever, starting from small babies, their mothers, their parents, their grandparents, and my friends. And these are very, very different questions. And those questions is, first of all, translated into exposure assessment. Because exposure assessment, and by very large, is actually a quantitative exercise. And so what really the exposure assessment does, and look at this red text in the green box, and the exposure assessment and actually needs input from the hazard identification. And for example, the lecture you have just heard on the microbe, if there would be a metabolites that we know that it can cause safety concern to human population, and we must look at the exposure for that substance as a whole, let's say, targeted. And for example, if the organism is a QPS, and so we already, by the previous knowledge, we know that it's safe. We don't have to worry about the constituents, that its residue may be carried into foods. Then I think you can say that, all right, I can park that aside. Then you think about the presentation of Christina yesterday afternoon, the manufacturing process. And I will take the food enzyme as examples throughout my presentation, because that's the area I'm mostly familiar with. And then you can think of, okay, to produce an enzyme from a microorganism, and we have to destroy the cells sometimes, and we may have to make a selective extraction. So here, extraction solvents comes into play. We may wish to concentrate, and we may wish to add a stabilizer, or even we may wish to immobilize it. And so the immobilization agents, and if it's by very weak chemical linkage, no problem. And however, if you would do cross-linking, because you would like to use the enzyme, immobilize the enzyme in a continuous closed system, for the production, you need a strong reaction not to lose the enzyme, and in that case, that let's say chemically cross-linked chemical may also be washed and the residue get carried into. So all those belong to the hazard identification and the characterization step, and that would decide what are we going to look in the exposure assessment. And that's why this is a solid line, and this means that you can't do without. And the same type of substances would also direct the risk identification. Yesterday afternoon, again, you heard the talk from David Gott, and he talked about toxicological evaluation. And that is when you feed the substance and to an animal, in a classical toxicology, that's it. And a more modern toxicology, you would first start with in vitro studies, and before, as a last resort, embark on animal testing, because fundamentally animal testing has a difficulty is how can I extrapolate the finding from a rodent to human, despite the fact that a human and mouse or rats, genomically, we share 93% of similarity. And is that 7% actually make mouse a mouse and a human? So just think about it. And okay, so with this 2 lines introduced, and I would wrap it up by saying that, let's say you solved the hazard identification and you solved the risk identification, and you managed to derive a threshold or departure point to draw the conclusion of being safe or not safe. At the end, you have the exposure estimates come into play, and you need to combine it. And this combination, and focus on the last arrows here, and would allow you as a risk assessor to draw a conclusion that, okay, I'm characterizing the risk now, at which magnitude, at which frequency I'm talking about, and this would be your conclusion, and this conclusion is given to risk manager, and from there they would make a decision whether we need any control actions, or it can be used, let's say quantum satis, means it's so safe, use as you wish. And of course, yesterday you heard in the morning lecture that for any government and or for example European Union to take a decision on the food safety, and the consideration is not only risk assessment but also other elements like cultural value, and that's not to be neglected. And then also like acceptable risk levels. And I think here is most well elaborated with environmental risk assessment, for example, accidental release of genetic material. So I think with these slides, I hope you can manage to put the lectures of yesterday and the lectures by Liev before me, and now into context, and by that you can follow with me to the crash course. And the food safety risk assessment, it is, food. What is a food? We always need a definition, and very good that in Europe and the food was given and in law. And there is a lot of words, you can just chew on them one by one, because that's where you would need it during the problem formulation. So I want to read it out loud for you. You can read it. And I would like to emphasize that a food hazard, so any agents, be biological, chemical, or physical, those are hazards. They are not a risk. And whether it's a risk or not, it's necessary to consider the magnitude and frequency of exposure. So for food and dietary exposure, that's the direct roots of human exposure. So always bearing in mind that distinguish hazard and risk. I know these words are very frequently misused in a way, because people use it in an interchangeable way. Actually, by listening to the talk of a person, you would actually almost be able to have a guess on the level of competence of whether the person is a risk assessor or not. Just listen carefully the use of these 2 words. And all right, so back again and focusing on the dietary exposure. And as I said, it's rather a quantitative exercise. So even negligible is defined in this case. And for dietary exposure, we focus on the oral ingestion. So the key elements are in these 3 and flashcards. So how much are we talking about? How often? Of course, how long? 3 elements. And I want to illustrate you the importance of dietary exposure assessment, really using this tilted line in the middle of these slides. So I repeat that a food hazard is not automatically a health risk. So it is necessary to combine with the exposure estimates. And so there are many questions in the problem formulation you could embed into the risk assessment strategy before you start. So for example, I just listed something. What is the average or high level of exposure in the population? So you can see here, are we looking for average, or are we looking for P75, P95, or whatever that the protection goal dictates you to look at? Is it a population? Is it within a subpopulation? And nowadays, there are a lot of data available actually to allow you to have an answer to both questions at the same time. And I will give you an example later on. And instead, and what risk management do is taking these estimates, taking the prediction of risk, actually the conclusion if you wish, and they decide what kind of management option is it has to be contained, and is it necessary to be labeled, the products, to warn, for example, lactose intolerance population, or some population like a pregnant woman, they have to be careful when they take supplements. There could be risk of overtaking it, or it could be that they need to take it because physiologically they just don't have enough for themselves and for the fetus inside. And so the question, and again the 4 flashcards on the bottom, is a simplified version of what kind of risk management options that is really offered there. So nothing to worry. This is translated into quantum satis, and less amount. So there would be recommended national dietary maybe intake guidelines, and you can read abundance of that. And from US, they are very good at that. And should it be less frequent? Same thing. And also, do we need to label? And sometimes it is necessary to give an informed decision. Okay, so here, and I'm taking you really into the door of dietary exposure now. You can see that we have 3 types of approach to take. Deterministic, this is elementary school mathematics. Really, you take value A, multiply with value B, and you will have the dietary intake estimates. And this is when data is really scarce, you do that, or when there is no time and to do anything more fancy. And there is another way, is deterministic, and that you could use individual food consumption data. And that started to require a little bit of a scale, at least a proficiency with Excel table. The first one, no, a calculator or hand calculation is enough. Second one, a bit more. The third one is if we are dealing with highly risky compounds, in that case, probabilistic is really necessary, and like a dioxin. And that is absolutely, not only we need to use individual food consumption data because it offers, let's say, the details on a country level, on a population level, but not only that. Also, the concentration of the substance can have a distribution. So when you take the distribution of 2 data sets, and then you are doing a probabilistic model, and these are very time consuming, and you need a statistician or mathematicians to help you. And always, and of course, the more work we put in and the higher accuracy the outcome will be. And so bearing in mind on that too. And you don't need to do, maybe I sometimes say, you don't need a cannon to shoot a bird. If you are very good, you know what you are looking at, and perhaps just a very old-fashioned rifle is enough. So food consumption data, and this is something, and for the audience wish to become a dietary exposure assessor, it's necessary, and you look into what kind of data behind the data sets you are going to use. So you can see that food consumption data can come from different sources, can come from consumption survey, and there are 4 types, and you can see the bullet point there. And sometimes it's by memory, and so the more population and the survey is carried out, and the more representative would be. However, the beauty of that is that you can have also demographic information of that individual you are taking, and including body weight, including gender, including occupation, including income, and so on, and whatever you wish to stratify later on these estimation values. And the second one is dietary recall, and very much rely on memory. And this is done usually in maybe elderly people's house and hospitals, because you can't go and ask individual patients or elderly residents, and you have to rely on, let's say, their helpers, because the food they are offered, they are not cooking by themselves. And so the dietary recall. And another one is a food frequency or propensity method. And I think that I let you to read because I don't want to bombard you with too much information. And the dietary history, absolutely. And second, when the food consumption data from the survey is not available, and in the science community, there is an exploration of using household budget survey and to extrapolate. So there is by purchase. So every time you go to supermarket, and sometimes you are asked, do you have a loyalty program? And the moment they scan your cards, and that data become available for household budgetary survey. But of course, these represent the quantity of food purchased for that household, that family, but doesn't mean that that is consumed. Imagine we have residue, organic waste to throw away, and that is not considered in this kind of survey. In addition, and the single units for the household budget is a household, is not individual. So also that, and has some value and has some drawback. The last one, which has been very popular, and in perhaps until 10 years ago, is food production statistics. In many countries, still, that's the only options available. And FAO, starting from the year 70s, begin to create food balance sheets, and later on, and get substituted and by the global environmental monitoring system. And there they put out some cluster diet. For example, in Europe, a lot of dairy get consumed, and in Latin America, a lot of meat products get consumed, so clustered diet. And but I must say that today, and if you are just caught in the middle of a meeting, you don't have any other sources, you can have it at handy, but you need to have a rough idea of a substance that you are looking at and make an estimation. And still, the food balance sheets still can be useful. It's available online. It's basically the production. So a production of a country and the import data, and minus, let's say, some country minus waste, some country not. So, and pay attention to that and how you are using it. So here, these slides, I just give you a bit of pro and cons for each method, because I would like maybe to, how to call that, help you to incise this idea that whenever you have actual food consumption data, please use it, and or make an effort and to make it very handily available. And So the golden standard is dietary record and food diary, and these two methods goes hand in hand. And you can see that when you record the foods consumed from 1 to 7 days, and this 1 day is acute exposure, but 7 days you can begin to make an average, in particular when the 7 days covers a weekend, because quite often on weekend we eat in a totally different pattern, eating with friends, eating in a restaurant, and so on and so forth. And so another very big advantage is with this method, you can collect, let's say, the portion size. So the portion size can be estimated by looking at a picture, and there will be someone assist you to do the dietary record, and you as an individual, the consumer, will be asked to record and with a little booklet, food diary. In that case, they are also asked to please weigh everything before you cook. So it's of great value and such data. And I think I will just really flying through the second slides, because the slides will be available to you, and I don't go deep into each methods. And if you have questions, you have my email address, or better, you can read and literatures, and I'm happy to answer you. And this is another one, the dietary recall, and this offers a second quality of consumption data available today. And this covers 1 to 3 days. So if you want to make a chronic exposure, and this data is, you really have to pound on the outcome. And of course, this one I mentioned, and it's also by questionnaire, it's assisted, and it's really on the habitual consumption, very much rely on the memory, and the big disadvantage is actually close the food list. So you can't say that this morning I ate banana, yogurt, and some cereals, and then you can even say, well, it contains oat, and it has some, I don't know, grape raisins. You can even try to say 1%, you know. No, with food frequency method, you can't have that. It's predefined. But with food diary, you can. Diet history, and it's almost all, let's say today, this method has been abandoned. However, data collected by this method is still available. And I want to emphasize that not every country has the manpower and the economical resources to go for the best data. For this reason, and EFSA has a EU menu program. Basically, EFSA fund member states and to either to create the food dietary survey for the first time, or to renew it. And we would like to have the data, so we also partially fund such a program. And I don't know whether any one of you has been involved in that. It's quite an exercise, and I think it's very interesting. Okay, so with the EU menu project, and I could come to introduce you about the EFSA comprehensive database. So here is the data has been collected in almost all the European member states, and collected by the member states, and cleaned and consolidated, compiled, and by EFSA. And this is a database. And if you are looking at European consumer, and I could almost tell you that, look, the hard job is already done, and the data is presented to you on the plate in a silver dish, and make use of it. And I have a screenshot on the left side. You can see that the consumption data and has been presented by 7 levels, 7 detailed levels of food groups. So the very first one, if you are only look at a grain, so if you are looking at, for example, pesticide residue, and the level 1 and could be sufficient. But if you are looking at the transfer of the residue into foods, and you may need to go to level 2, like fine bakery products, cakes, just the example. That's level 3. There are many different types of cakes there. And if you said that, oh no, it's only some cake, and then you can go to level 4. And if you the residue you are looking at is actually in the cream, and okay, then you go to level 5, you look at the cream cake. And level 6, maybe cheesecake, and pay attention. And the cheesecake in different country has different recipe. So really look at the country specific data when you have to use the data. And even level 7. So I think I encourage all of you really go to the website and play around with it. And not to say that this data on the food side has 7 levels you could choose, but on the country side, and it's individual country, and you could also choose population or consumer. What's the difference between the two? So the population is a number of a population that is really in that country, but consumer is the person give the data. And so there, and means for one food, not every respondent has consumed that food. So the consumer data comes from the one really have consumed that food. So if you look at some very dangerous substances, or if you really want to protect a certain very narrow population, you wish to use consumer data. So on the right side, the feature of this database, and I think several of it I have already explained to you. Maybe we could focus on the last 4 bullet points. First of all, is the most recent data. What definition of recent is basically depending on the country. For some country is within the last 3 years. For some country is within the last 5 years. And so there are in total 2,500 food groups, and that's where we are able to dissect them into 7 levels. And it really allows the different level of aggregation. So once you have the most detailed the level, like a 7 level, you can work backwards and aggregate as you wish. And here is also an overview about what is behind the data. So this table, I hope you will be able to appreciate how robust the EFSA comprehensive database is. So 23 member states. Now you see Europe has more than 23 member states. So there are 4 members, and they are still doing the dietary survey. And how many surveys? 51, so you can already know. And some country has 1 or 2 surveys in it. And then the subjects, so the number of people that have participated to the survey, and is 94,000. And national food codes. So the codes, each country has its own codes in its native language. And once that data is collected, and we translate it into English, and we also standardize it. So what's the meaning of standardization? In a way, it's also aggregation, and into the FoodX code. And currently, FoodX code has about 1,600. And the consumption records, wow, I don't need to read the number to you. And you can see this is a population. And we have, it's stratified by age. And infants, toddler, children, and elderly, and up to very elderly, and even some special population. What are the special population? So they are pregnant women, for example. And then, these details, the number, if you work on it, the number makes sense. Otherwise, you can chat about it. So here, and again, with all this data, and you said, oh, come on, what am I going to do with the data? And I can only handle Excel, but I have to do the job. Okay, don't worry. And actually, EFSA taking advantage that we have the expertise, and we pay back the taxpayer money by offer service, basically. And you can see that here I listed and 5 dietary exposure tools back to you. Those tools are so simple. You actually only need to input one value and select with the drop-down menu, select whatever you wish to select. So what to select, that's your knowledge. And then you can immediately have the outcome and stratified by population, by country, and so on and so forth. So I will perhaps very briefly introduce the differences. So I saw a lot of questions about novel foods. So for people interested in novel foods, and have a look at the Dietary, and you can find it in the EFSA website. And for people interested in food additives and for chronic exposure, and also the FAME, and it's available on the EFSA website. And myself, I'm interested in the food enzyme intake model. And this is something, let's say, is still under construction, and a lot is already available. I will also give a little details later. And for feed additive, consumer exposure. So read those words. Immediately you know feed additive is given to an animal, and the consumer is consuming animal products via, let's say, perhaps potential residues carried into meat or egg, so animal products. So there, and they have come up and with both acute and chronic exposure model. So a lot of extrapolation has already been done for you. And pesticide, and there they did a very good job, and to really offer the possibility for acute and chronic. The level of detailness and is very much manifested by the different levels of food aggregates. So try it out. It will be really fun.
You have still 4 minutes.
Okay, we'll be really fast here. So the food intake model, and here is really about food enzyme. Imagine food enzyme is added to the grain and then carried into cake. And this afternoon you have an amylase, and you are going to encounter that situation. So you can see that the level of aggregation sometimes and can come from the bread directly. Sometimes you need to look at the flour or even the grain. So depending on what you are looking at, you see, and the use level dictates how you are going to combine those data. So if you are interested and really read and the documents in the guidance document, it will explain you what is the meaning of those process and what are the technical factors. And the dietary exposure, the simplest, as I said, elementary math is this formula. You have concentration, consumption, you multiply, but most frequent, you don't have that direct. And perhaps some novel foods and food additive you can, but for most of the food chemical, you can't. So what to do? And this what to do actually involves a lot of things. And you need really the food terminology. So for example, Foodex, to bring what the occurrence data is expressed and the consumption data is expressed to the same line. And once you bring them to the same level, you still need the technical factors and to allow actually the bridging. So I give the example of enzyme per kilogram of barley as a concentration data and the amount of beer. So how much barley is really in the beer? That's the technical factor we're looking at. And this one, I just want to tell you that for people doing dietary exposure, especially you want to do probabilistic or even deterministic is very much a Sherlock Holmes exercise, and you need to be patient and go through and technical data to derive, for example, and the bullet point on the right side, and what are we looking at. And behind the enzyme intake, these are the input factors we are looking at. You see there are 3 factors. F1 is really converting, or maybe would even be better, let's start with F2, that's better, you know better. So if we are talking about maybe a flour, and then you are looking at how much flour is in the cereal flakes, in the muesli, in the bar, in the cake, and so on. They are different. And then from the flour, you really have to convert back to what you're looking at. This table shows you molasses. So that's why from a molasses means from the sugar beet. So I would need, and how many kilos? So 40 kilos of sugar beet in order to obtain 1 kilos of molasses. So that's what the 40 really means. The F3, just to show you that not all the cereal flakes contains molasses. So we give a factor about it, and this information are extracted from database. And this is a calculator you can use, as I said, that if you just type in the number where the 500 is written, push the enter button, and the outcome is really like the screenshots there. You will have it on different age populations. You have the minimum mean and maximum mean, and as well as for the P95. So it's really easy. And I won't spend time on it because this part is really, really easy. You will get excited. And here in these slides, and these are all the different enzyme intake model is available. And it's based on food manufacturing processes. If you go to Zenodo, you download. And this afternoon, if you have time, go to Zenodo and download. I will put the baking direct link in the chat if you wish, and play with it. And you probably will discover much more details than you could imagine. So my last slides, and I didn't want to warn you with too much things, but keep in mind, it's a multidisciplinary science. It's a Sherlock Holmes exercise. The design is very important, and each substance that comes from the hazard identification and characterization. So don't forget to look at what you are looking for. And also when you choose a model, so let's say the more fatigue and you make, the more refined estimate and you are going to get. So really no one size fits all, and choose upon your needs. With this, I think, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.